So I guess we both have spoken a little bit. We'll start with you. And my first question to you is, you've advised some of the biggest companies in the world on strategy. And so from the lens of the top CEOs of the world, what is the state of play of AI? And even from your lens, what's the state of play as far as AI is concerned today?
Well, you know that famous joke that I think Dan Ariely made about 5-6 years ago. And he said that AI is like teenage sex, meaning everyone talks about it, but very few people have actually done it. But everyone assumes that everyone else has done it. And it's, of course, it's a slightly inappropriate joke, but it is true. And so we do regular, not just informal meetings, but also regular research all over the world, all sectors. It doesn't matter where it is. And if you ask all leadership teams about AI or digital in general, but certainly on the topic of AI, 9 out of 10 agree on the promise and the importance and the strategic importance for the company and for the industry and, by the way, for society at large. There's no debate about that. And in every annual meeting in Davos, it is one of the main topics. And Mr. Harari is becoming a more famous speaker because of that. And so there's no doubt that people see the promise. But if you then dig a little bit deeper and you ask, what have you actually done with it? Have you actually done something with it, wherever it is? Then it's a minority, maybe 4 out of 10. Depends a bit on the sector. There's certain sectors where it has been a bit better, like in the energy sector has really picked up because a lot of data, particularly oil and gas. That's logical. Healthcare was mentioned. Is it a few? But most industries, consumer goods or finance or you name it, it's a minority. And if you then ask, have you had achieved positive results with that, then it's even lower than that. So our conclusion is it will take a while before really it is broad-based implemented and people are positive and have achieved the ability to make it work. So that's I think the main answer to your question, and to give a little bit more, maybe one context to it. I think that is true in general of the so-called digital revolution. We're now over 20 years into the digital revolution, aren't we? It was invented in the 90s, and we've been working on it ever since. And on a personal level, we all run our lives with these things. I mean, this morning I booked a hotel and I did Uber, and everything is. This runs quite well, and startups and techs and the Googles, of course, use it too. But I can assure you, 99% of established companies run on emails and Excel sheets and old ledgers and what have you, really. And the implementation is very, very slow. It will take a very long time. And so that is true in general of digital. That's particularly true, I think, of AI. That does not diminish the importance and the reason for talking about that and trying to understand it, but it will go slower than we all think.
And I'd love to unpack that as to why it will go slower. And before that, Hannah, my question to you is, you're a mathematician and you've done a lot of work in the field of AI. Is fundamentally artificial intelligence, is it ill-defined or well-defined? Is intelligence a well-defined problem in the first place? Because it seems like whatever happens, we can say it's just a program, right? It's not, intelligence is exactly what the machine can't do, as some people have defined, right? So is it an ill-defined problem, and where is the state of play, according to you, just from a mathematician's lens?
Okay, so I think the short answer is no, it's not very well defined. I think even intelligence, right, is like an incredibly difficult thing to define. There's not a universally agreed upon definition of what it means. I think that I've seen a huge range of definitions of what AI means. So there are some people who would say, particularly the kind of old school AI researchers, who would say that AI is anything where you are, I can't remember the exact wording for this, but essentially where you are outsourcing some kind of decision making to an artificial machine, right? So, in that case, email, right, is, if you're, anything that you're encoding is essentially some form of artificial intelligence.
And a cooking recipe as well.
Yeah, right, exactly. But then at the other end of the spectrum, people like DeepMind, they define AI as anything that is capable of learning, right? So they really emphasize on the learning, and particularly not just learning from data, not just learning retrospectively from data, but learning from the environment, kind of a sort of real-time feedback loop. So I think that the question of where is AI now and how different is it, in many ways depends on that first step, depends on, well, what the hell do you mean by AI? In terms of where we are right now, though, I mean, I kind of think that, I was thinking about what you were saying about that 4 out of 10, right, which I just think that's sort of interesting. And I think that in a way, actually, a lot of the times, the questions that people want answering don't really require AI, or don't really require learning, right? Don't really require a sort of active agent who's learning from its environment. They don't really require, I mean, you can get a long way with logistic regression, you know what I mean? And I really mean that. Don't mean that in a dismissive way. There was a study very recently by a guy called Matt Sauganik. He's a computational social scientist, really impressive guy. What he's done is a study of 5,000 people, 5,000 teenagers, and he has data for them for every year of their life up until their 18th birthdays, and everything you can imagine, right? Their parents' jobs, whatever, their DNA, everything. And what he's done is he's released that data in 5 stages, so that people can look at the transitions for individuals from one stage to the next. What they decided to do was to hold back that last stage, to hold back that last layer. So, and to ask people to predict from age 12 what these kids would end up being at 18. And loads of people, they ran a competition, loads of people submitted their responses, loads of AI, all of the swankiest, Random Forest, all of the swankiest algorithms you can imagine. And they all got submitted. The very best one didn't beat logistic regression, right? So I'm not dismissive about the simpler techniques. So I think, in a lot of situations, actually, you don't need these really complicated newfangled models. You only really need them when you have a very clear objective, a very well-defined measure of success, and where you have a vast solution space that cannot be searched efficiently.
Which means no real-world problems, because no real-world problem is that well-defined. And
okay. Well, you can sometimes force a well-defined problem onto a real situation.
Which is a sort of a subset of the actual problem, and which leads to all the unintended consequences, like people driving into rivers and so on. So those.
Agreed.
So coming back to you, you mentioned 4 on 10, and you said it's going to be slow.
Yeah.
What is the gap between?
Why? Or
my question is, if you look at the Googles and Facebooks and other Netflixes of the world, at their Amazon, they're using all of these learning techniques. They're implementing at scale. In fact, it's scary for some people what they are able to do, right? But why is that not happening in case of the regular Fortune 100 companies?
because most established firms have been grown and designed over decades, and because most managers tend to be analog by training and when they grew up in firms. Most systems and performance evaluations and metrics and what makes a good firm or what makes a person or a manager a good manager or a department good or bad is based on old metrics. And firms are run that way. And so we've built all those organizational, formal and informal both, over many decades. And it's very, very hard to measure. Most recently, and it was a very sad day, Clay Christensen died, who was a Harvard professor and one of the, I think, the best writers about innovation. And he wrote a famous book in the 90s called The Innovator's Dilemma, and this is exactly what he wrote about. He wrote about that all the formal systems in organizations, particularly in companies, hold back innovation, really breakthrough innovation, because the metrics simply don't allow for it, and also the informal metrics don't allow for it. So that's one of the big reasons that it's very hard to do. And then on top of that, something like AI. I mean, Hannah understands AI, but most managers don't. And a lot of people have irrational fears about it and thinks that their jobs will be eaten up, including the managers, particularly the managers, I would argue. So there's fear that plays a role in all of this. Why would you Why would you go all out in doing that? It seems irrational almost. And so we should not be surprised that it's slow. I think, and it sounds perhaps contradictory or ironic, what will hold back AI is not the technology or the data. I'm not at all afraid of that. It's the human beings and our ingenuity and our engagement, perhaps even more than creativity, to use it and to make it work and to change who we are and where we want to go and where we don't want to go, including all the examples. I think that is the key thing that will determine the speed.
I understand the big barriers of fears as well as the general resistance to innovation that happens inside organizations. But I think my experience is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the companies that even want to do that, that have transcended those barriers, some of those cultural barriers, are still struggling to get value out of AI. They're not yet implemented at the scale that they should, and the results are not as impressive as they thought they will be. In some of these companies, maybe the culture doesn't allow it. But what do you think are the other sort of, even once people have crossed that, let's say efficiency, right? I know this will save me $20 million or $100 million if I did this, right? Now, so argument is clear. Corporations are very focused on driving bottom line improvements. So there's no resistance. The CEO wants it. But then still, the projects are not as successful. The results are less than stellar. So I mean, at least that's our experience. So any thoughts?
I would broadly agree with that. The CEO is the nice thing about a corporation is the CEO is a dictator in the end, but that is nice on paper, but in reality it doesn't work that way, as we all know. It's slightly more complex. And what I've seen is, I said that the minority, 4 out of 10 best, have begun to work with AI, and it's really at best. The number is probably lower than that. Is that then the question is, what type of initiatives have there been? It has mostly been performance and savings and efficiency type of exercises, because the idea is you have the shortest payback. It's the easiest thing to do, and that's the first thing that springs to mind. And if you then look at it objectively, where's most of the value? It's actually not in the efficiency side of the house, so to speak. It's in the upside. It's in the revenues. It's in the new business creation. That's where the real value is. I mean, that's what Facebook and Google have done in the end. But most established companies tend not even to focus on that. So if they focus on anything, it's on efficiency, the efficiency side, and it's much less on the creation and new business side. And it's really a pity, because I think the resistance from people is much less if we create something new, and particularly if you involve them, than if you only focus on making it run much more efficient. So if I would advise anyone, is to first of all, to engage people right from the start. It's more important even than anything else, very early on. And second, to focus on the value side, the creation side, and not so much on the efficiency one. That will come. I'm not that worried about it.
Your thoughts? I mean, in your experience of working with the non-digital natives, what do you see as the big barriers for adoption of AI or success of AI in real-world, messier problems?
Oh gosh, in messier problems. I think in a way, I think it's that people often don't really know what it does, right? I think that it's I've definitely had a lot of conversations with people where they've been like, okay, here's our objective, here's what our data looks like. Can you just fill in that gap between it with AI? It's like, well, no, it just doesn't, it doesn't quite work like that. You've got to have, there's only a very, very particular type of problem that you can use this hammer to attack. It's not that everything looks like a nail. So I think for me, that's part of it. I think that if you don't have the, I think that there's no shortage of data, right? Everyone's drowning in data. I think it's knowing what to do, knowing what question to ask, and knowing what questions can be answered. I think for me, that's where the real barrier is. Because we've got the techniques, we've got the data. It's just, marrying the two together.
Got it. And in what we are seeing in our experience is that the challenge of the data, while data is available, just to get that to work in the organizational setting is harder than what meets the eye, and therefore that it becomes a barrier in itself, and people want magic solutions, and magic doesn't happen that easily.
No, quite.
And then the next thing is about just understanding and framing the right problem and solving the right problem, which is just having a clear idea of the problem statement and sort of questioning that problem statement again, and then finding a good way to think of human and machine. I'll give you one simple example. We're working with one of the largest consumer goods manufacturers who wanted to forecast their sales across a whole range of categories. We started with tea, and the question was, can you beat the demand planner by 5%? And that's the framing, right? So first cut, yes, Algo beats the demand planner by 8 percentage points, so it's significantly better. But the next thing is, now let's do it across whole range of categories and countries, and let's see if it's consistently beating it. And what we realize is that it's not consistently beating the demand planner. And the reason is simple. Demand planners have access to a totally different data set compared to the people, the algorithm, right? The algorithm is seeing the sales and whatever, data, previous sales data and supply chain data and so on, but the demand planners actually have access to retail stores, they make phone calls, they have understanding of the news.
Yeah.
These kinds of data sets are not flowing into the algorithm. So the combination of humans and machines would have solved that problem much better, but once it's framed as you have to beat a demand planner, it just, either them or us. And demand planners, by the way, don't like that idea very much because they really want this to be defeated, and because they think they add value. So you're setting them up in the wrong way in multiple different contexts, right? Not just because you're not framed the right problem, but you also have a perverse incentive for people to say that it's not working. So the question is, could we have said, can we have better forecasts as a combination of humans and machines? Probably we could have done better. But framing itself was an issue. So, like some of the examples you mentioned, exactly playing out in the corporate world as well for much more sort of real world, sort of thorny problems and very high value problems. Forecasting is probably a $1 billion problem for most big Fortune 100 companies, but that's where it is.
I'm reminded, in you saying that, I'm really reminded about this thing about wisdom. So, okay, pretty much every culture in the world has independently created this idea of wisdom being something where it's about applying knowledge in a very context-specific way, right? About like taking into account all of the peculiarities and not ignoring any level of detail and still being able to make your knowledge make use, right? And in a way, all of this stuff with AI, it's like the exact opposite end of the spectrum. It's like, is there a generalizable tool that you can pick up and drop off in different situations? And I think that that's an incredibly important point, right, that you make about the different types of data that people have access to. I think that like AI is not wisdom, and I think it's really important to remember that.
Exactly, and because AI today is very, very good when the problem is clearly specified and in a very narrow sense, right? An AI that plays chess is not able to play a board game or something else. It's very, very hard to make it generalizable, and that's where really we haven't solved the basic intelligence problem. Coming to the first question itself, right? That's because we're narrowly, when the problem is well defined, yes, AI can beat it, but it can't be generalizable, and that's again something that people really don't understand, and people want good answers, magical answers to those questions.
So to continue on that one, I wrote a couple of years back an article titled "The Case for Automating Leadership." It had a question mark behind it, by the way. I'm
glad.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of leaders that were also happy with that question mark. But the central thesis was, if you look at how does the average manager in an organization spend his or her time, over 50% is what I like to call admin. And of various types.
That's right.
And a good third is problem solving, and then maybe on the top you have strategy and dealing with people issues and what have you. And so isn't it great news that digital and machines, etc., can automate this admin stuff? I can use different words for that. I usually use different words for that, but you can imagine all this admin stuff. So you can finally focus your time on where we are good at. Judgment, you called it specificity, but I think judgment is wisdom,
Yep.
or empathy, or dealing with people, or creativity. To think out of the box is still something uniquely human. I've not seen many algorithms that can do that better. And so isn't it fantastic news to begin to work there? I think it is. So not automating, but shifting and having this handshake.
So we discussed the problems of design, especially we discussed the alignment of incentives, how humans and machines should work together, or issues of fairness and bias, and which, Hannah, your talk eloquently described that. Now, how do we get that, how do that make that work in an organizational setting? How easy is it for corporations to become evil, or just be sort of stupid, not just necessarily evil, but actually just not having the right problem is just being stupid, and that itself can lead to very bad consequences for the business and for their customers as well?
Well, it's a little bit what we talked about. First of all, it's very important that if you look at the initiatives that you want to take as a company, is that you involve the people right away from the start. And companies, and I say that, but companies really don't have the tendency to do that. The tendency is always, leadership needs to determine what strategy should be, with the help of a couple of smart people usually, and then it's planned and then it's thrown over the wall and then you need to implement that. That's still how most companies work. In this time of rapid change, and these are revolutionary times in many ways, you cannot do that anymore. Because your pace, your speed of change will be too slow, and the people will hold you back. And so therefore now it's even more important, that's what my book on strategy was about, to involve people right from the start in the strategy development, even before you've figured it all out, so that there's more ownership and that people really work with it. Don't plan everything. Allow room for learning and failing, and that loop. That is incredibly important to do. And focus your initiatives, and that's the second. So the first one is involve people right early on, and the second one is focus your initiatives as much as you can on new business development that is outside the firm. So you have less defensiveness, and there's an immediate payback in terms of new revenues. Hard to do, but it can be done. Those will be the two things.
And how, if a company were to define, this is my AI strategy. Many companies have an AI strategy or are developing one, or in the early phase of implementing one.
Very early.
So as someone who's consulted with the biggest companies in the world, if you had to help them define the AI strategy, what would that look like? What would components of an AI strategy look like?
Well, I would certainly not begin with the state of the technology and what's possible, and with respect, because that will become clear anyway, and it's changing every day anyway. Yeah. So I would not begin with that. I would begin with what the consumer possibilities are, and looking into the market. I would be consumer-centric, and then I would immediately go human-centric. Those would be the two focus areas that I would use.
Just to add on to that, actually, so one practical, tying into your previous question about how do you make sure that you don't end up becoming evil and so on, one practical suggestion which I really like, which I've used myself a couple of times actually, is when you're having those creative meetings of like, okay, what's possible, what could we do, what's the best case scenario, let's imagine the optimistic version of the future, is to have alongside that a sort of disastrous brainstorming session where everyone in the room is like, what is the worst possible outcome of this? What is the worst possible thing that could happen? Because I think that, talking to people in Facebook in particular, I think that a lot of the stuff that has hit them, it's not that it came as a surprise necessarily, it's that they just hadn't realized that people would be trying to exploit their platform in that way. And I think that pausing and having that moment where you're like, if I was as evil as I possibly could be, what's the worst thing that I could do?
And Mark Zuckerberg basically talks about saying about this problem as saying first is design the right way, for sure. They have to design it for various things. But then the abuse is a totally different thing. You cannot design a system for not being abused. So you have to have a design which works for the general situation and have a completely different way of tackling how abuse of the system could happen as well.
I'm not sure I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, me neither. So back to Mark Zuckerberg and Google and Amazon to a large extent too. So to get the strategy right remains incredibly important. And the backlash that we've seen in the last 1-2 years against those companies really goes back to them having a business model that increasingly looks flawed. Because the business model makes their money on advertising, and the advertising is driven by data that they generally get for free. And that is the business model. It doesn't have to be the business model. That's a choice that was made over a decade ago, that choice. So the strategy still remains incredibly important. So pick your right one before you do that.
It seems
spend
like
your time in doing that.
It seems like the advertising business model is stuck in a sort of a Nash equilibrium.
Yes.
Where there's no incentive for either party to move out. If you move out of either, if a business says, I'll start paying, you'll have to start paying for something, then customers are going to go. And customers are not going to pay for it because they're getting it free. So they're locked into the system.
Yes.
So dislodging that and going to a subscription or a model
but that problem
easy.
can be solved. I mean, human beings are quite creative. You can think of different business models, and you can pay for a person's data. I think the current annual rate for an annual set of data for any person is around £700-800, I'm told. So anyway, but you can design different business models for that. It's totally solvable, I think. But for me, the main thing is in all of this, time is, so that's why I said it will take a long time. I don't think that's bad, that it will take a long time. My favorite study is the one of the good old ATM, the machine. 60s, 70s, 1960s and 70s it was rolled out. Everyone was afraid that the human tellers were going to lose their job. In the meantime, in the US alone, there are 400,000 of those ATMs, but the employment in bank branches has doubled. And so what happened is that the bank branch became cheaper to operate because of those machines, and the human beings shifted towards customer advice and the other stuff that they do. And that's great. Now let's see what happens in the future now with all the internet banks, how it will take off. I would bet, however, that there remains a need for human contacts for those branches. Yeah. Banks might find out that these branches are more valuable than they think they are. So it takes time to figure out these strategies and to figure out mistakes that you've made, just like maybe Google and Facebook are scratching their head right now.
So I think actually, I actually agree with what you said. I know that, it's more interesting when we don't agree, but I agree with what you're saying. And I think that actually a lot of the problems that have happened with these big tech companies is because of the exact opposite incentive, right? I think that with the VC culture, the way that things are, is that your only option, if you create a new company, a new idea, your only option is to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow until you essentially have a monopoly, and then that's the point where you stop and try and clean up all of the mess that you made along the way, right? I mean, I don't have a fundamental problem with the advertising model of generating revenue. My problem with it is like the way that it's been done, the tweak, the way that it's been set up is that it has these unintended consequences. And I think that like actually sometimes doing things slower is how to avoid a lot of this stuff.
And coming to the question on ethics and the way you mentioned about thinking of the disaster consequences, one of the things that I'm told Amazon does is to have a customer's voice in every meeting. So it's like a customer is sort of pseudo-present in every meeting. So
they're obsessed about
customer chair, right? There's a chair in the meeting which is customer, right? That way you're essentially seeing it from the customer's lens, every problem. And similar sort of thought experiment is to think of whether what happens, the newspaper test, which is if what we're doing today is published in the newspaper tomorrow, are we comfortable with that? And I think a lot of these decisions will become a lot easier to, especially given how media is these days. So you'll be very careful to not do some things because you know that this is not really newspaper, doesn't meet the newspaper test.
But you need that mental check, don't you? You need that mental check.
Amazon is a beautiful example, by the way. I think they are one of the best examples of companies that use time to their advantage. Now they can do it because they have all this cheap capital access that very few other companies have. But it's fascinating how they do that, including in meetings where they bring the customer in the meeting, including spending time to first of all understand what the issue is and really taking your time, reading all the words. Well, it's well written about, but I find it still fascinating. They use that well, I must say, to their advantage. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's open it for some questions. We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience?
Q&A session. Could I make sure that when you ask a question, you identify yourself before you ask it? Gentleman here. Can we bring a microphone along, please?
Hi, my name is Pranay Agrawal, and I'm one of the co-founders of Fractal, along with Shrikant. Hannah, this refers to your talk. You said that this idea of human versus machine is not the right idea. It is about, human and machine. Machines are better at something, humans are better at some other things. You all know Harari, whom you mentioned, in one of your answers. He is of the belief that eventually machines will get better at everything than humans, including at emotional intelligence. So they may not have the emotion, but they'll be superior at judging emotions of people than humans are, right? So the question then is that, do you think that it's merely a matter of time and technology before that happens, right? We do have this question of, general versus specific AI, but I think that a lot of work that we do is specific, and the amount of general work that we do is probably, a small percentage of what we do every day, right? So do you think it's only a question of time before, machines get better at everything? And if yes, then what is the role for humans? Is the only role defining problems?
Okay.
Elliptic question.
Right. Okay. So I think first off, I would argue. I think no, it's not just a question of time, or at the very least, I think it's not just a question of time in our lifetimes. Let me see if I can explain why. So we were talking earlier about how AI works really well when it's a very specific problem, and when you have a well-defined measure of success, right? So even if it's not, even if the problems become less specific, the well-defined measure of success is the thing that's really important. So you mentioned emotional intelligence, right? So at the moment you've got affect recognition, which can look at someone's face and say whether you're happy or sad or whatever, right? I kind of have a slight problem with that stuff because, okay, maybe being able to put yourself in two categories between are you happy or sad is okay, but what's the difference between being disgruntled and like mildly irritated, Or like how do you, there's not like, this isn't like a bucket system where you're like, oh, this is definitely how I'm feeling right now, right? These things exist on a spectrum, and that is not a situation in which like a quantitative assessment is ever going to be very good at analyzing. To give you the case of driverless cars, right? The problem with driverless cars, the reasons why these things make mistakes, has got nothing to do with driving a car. Driverless cars are amazing at driving cars. The problem is all the things to do with driving that are nothing to do with the highway code. So for instance, you're driving down a road, an ambulance is trying to get past you, and you need to mount the curb to allow the ambulance to get through. How the hell are you ever going to explain to a machine the type of situation in which it is okay for you to mount a curb, right? These are non-trivial problems that are not reduced easily to binary yes or no answers. And so that, I think, is the reason why, if we do get there, it's not just going to be more neural networks, more deep learning will get us there. We need a complete paradigm shift. We're not on the path to being able to solve those things.
And you don't think it's even a question of just more training? How did we learn to get on the curve? Because we saw it through experiences, we heard from others, and so on. You don't think it's merely a question of exposing the machines to more experiences and data?
I just don't think that the tools that we have right now are equipped enough for those very, very, very subtle and very, very hard problems.
Just to add further to that, so there's a whole range of techniques that are now saying, I will learn from human behavior, right? For example,
this is true.
The idea of inverse reinforcement learning, which is that earlier reinforcement learning was about taking actions, getting feedback from the environment and getting better. But what if that's not what you're doing? What you're essentially doing is observing humans. It's called apprentice learning. So you're observing humans and using their actions and then learning the objectives and their values as part of that. And maybe judgment, wisdom, these are things that machines will eventually learn by actually studying humans very well. But the question, even to that, the question is, do humans actually know are we consistent enough? We are probably not consistent, right? So humans it's not that we perfectly know what we are doing or perfectly can explain or even are consistent in our actions. So that's why it may be difficult. So in general, I think the complexity of the world is far higher than anything that currently is even remotely capable of reaching. So it's just the gap is too much. There are fundamental laws of physics and other kinds of barriers that might stop us from here to the sort of human level intelligence. So potentially, I think someone said it's like worrying about over-colonization in Mars, like super intelligence is like that. It's just way too far. And someone else said it's like Greeks thinking of we should land on the moon. They probably had the intention, but it took another 3,000 years for it to happen. So we're probably somewhat distant from that.
Can we have our...
Yeah, I would agree. We have a tendency of projecting in the future in a linear fashion. We all do, by the way, all human beings. And it's if you look at the cases, that's not the right way to do that. The case of the ATM is a case in point. Things happened that we could not predict, and everything influences everything else. And people tend to focus on areas where there's opportunity or have irrational fears going on. You cannot, it's very hard to predict the future in a linear fashion. That's the mathematical answer to it, perhaps?
Yeah, you can have that.
Our next question, please. Can we get the microphone to the back over here, please? And if you can identify yourself as well, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sumit. I'm a principal consultant at Fractal. And a part of my job actually requires me to, communicate the value of AI to our customers, right? And my question is on back of that, right? And what I've realized is it is fairly easy to, embrace AI when you really understand AI. If you do not have a great understanding of the concept, you tend to resist from that, right? I can give 3 examples of that, right? I mean, all of us use smartphones on a daily basis. So if a smartphone messes up, we don't mind. Probably we wouldn't even notice, right? And if I move that to, say, Netflix, if Netflix is showing me recommendations which I do not like, I'll get slightly annoyed. So that is the point where I have, I start getting annoyed. But when there is a lot more to lose, something like the example which you gave, Hannah, about the car crash, right? If AI messes up, I'll lose my life. So, so that, and probably that is happening because I do not understand AI that is actually going, behind the running on the car on the self-engine. I mean, I cannot imagine my 60-year-old mom sitting at the back of a car without a driver. It's an impossible situation. So do you think that is a valid observation? And how will that gap be actually bridged if people do not understand AI, will they ever embrace AI?
So this is the idea of the reputational risk to your company and you for having adopted the AI if everything goes wrong after. How do you overcome that fear, Jan?
I have met very few companies that are already in there because the implementation rate has been so low, frankly. Has it come up? Yes, it has come up. A couple of companies in insurance industries, which we can all imagine, right? What they do. There, it's beginning to pop up, but the degree of implementation of AI in the insurance sector is extraordinarily low still. You would be surprised. It will come up, I think. It has to, but it hasn't there yet. So those reputational questions, absolutely, I think they will come up, but I haven't seen many of them yet because it's still early days.
Shrikam, when you're advising your clients on this has got to be a topic that comes up.
Look, I think I fundamentally think that humans make tons of mistakes, right? But when AI makes the same mistakes, somehow it's much more problematic.
Yes.
And so one can say, look, it's unfair. Why are humans evaluated in a different way compared to AI? But I do feel like it's right because AI errors one human makes an error, he or she will die in the process or something might happen, might damage a few things. But an AI which can scale infinitely, right? If that makes an error, it could potentially, the errors can scale disproportionately as well. So I think it's good to have a higher bar for where AI should play. And whether it's self-driving cars and so on, I think it's good to do that because today, I can say that today if you have self-driving cars on roads of the US, 35,000 fewer people will die every year because that's the number of people who die every year in road accidents. That's already true. And maybe 100 people will die because of mistakes of the cars. But unfortunately, the argument doesn't work that way. We need a higher bar of higher threshold for AI to work because of the potential of the error scaling. in the real world.
And Hannah, you look at it from the outside, you stand up on stage, you give all the examples of when things go wrong. What do you think that the managers who are thinking about adopting this and go, God, I don't want it to be my example that ends up being used at conferences like this? What would your advice be to them?
Well, okay. I mean, I think that it's important to remember that there is a staggering amount to be gained from this stuff. I mean, you mentioned earlier about the new antibiotic. I mean, imagine, right? Like the value of that is just extraordinary. There's, you know, the protein folding stuff, the energy usage stuff. There's a staggering amount that can be done with this. Please don't think that I am in any way like negative about the use of AI. I think it is just, it is just putting that chair in from the customer, right? Or like thinking about the worst potential things that can happen. I think it's about going slowly. I think it's about treading carefully. You've just got to mitigate. I mean, every decision you make could potentially end in disaster, right? You just got to do everything you can to mitigate against it. And I think it's exactly the same with AI.
I was yesterday on the phone with American Express because I had a payment issue. And I'm sure you all recognize what I'm going to say. You have to go through endless robots and voices. And of course, after 2 minutes, I was so frustrated that I threw the phone down. And every time I find myself into that, and I'm right now looking for ways to go around that stupid robot in order to get to a real person that can answer my question. So that is a company that clearly has not put the customer at the center, right? They're after efficiency gains, and I think they're in the customer service business the last time I looked. So I hope there's no one from Amex in the room. But I would advise certainly that company to maybe shift their mindset.
Okay, another question, please. Let's take this gentleman just sitting over here, if we can bring a microphone over.
Hiya, Alim Laddick, Schroders Investment Management. So clearly, what we're talking about here is using AI for the right reasons to solve the right problems. So how could AI lend itself to fixing the coronavirus outbreak, for example, without, taking anyone who contracts the virus and just killing them off and making that decision?
I mean, it would help.
And clearly, the issue here is that we're under time here to make the right decisions.
Shall I answer this one? Because actually, immediately after this, I am going off to go and give a talk about this. One of the ways that you can use AI is that. So, in fact, we have done this a couple of years ago. I did a project with the BBC where we used an app to track people. People volunteered to be tracked. So the problem is that if you are deciding whether to close schools, whether to close to close train stations, to cordon off different areas, you need to have an idea. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis of it, right? It's not as simple as saying close the school, you're done, because actually young kids have intergenerational mixing that older adults don't have, right? They have much more contact across the generations, and then those adults go out and so on. So it's not as simple as like close the schools, everything's fixed. What you need is these really effective mathematical models that are capable of predicting how things will spread if option A versus option B. So we have this data set that's based on an app that's designed to do that, because up until now, all the data they're using, the current kind of gold standard in the UK, by the way, about how much we intermix that these models are based on, it's a paper survey from 2006, right, 15 years ago, of 1,000 people. Right? We have no idea, the epidemiologists have no idea how people in the UK actually move around, how far we travel, how many people we come into contact, no idea whatsoever. So a couple of years ago, we did this TV program where we were like getting people to use the app, and now it's about analyzing that data as quickly as we possibly can, while brainstorming about the worst possible case scenario if we release this data and people's individual privacy that could be violated if we do, and using all of the techniques that we're talking about here, all kinds of pattern recognition, machine learning techniques as quickly as we possibly can. Maybe not to stop on the biological side of halt the disease, but certainly to help the decision-making process, the strategic decision-making process, as accurate as possible.
Shrikant, this might be a problem that your clients come to you with. I'm guessing that part of when you're approaching it is about framing the problem in the right way. Can you talk me through your thought process for how you might answer the question?
I'll give you one of the examples from Hall of Shame of Fractal. So this was when H1N1 started, so spreading, and we were approached by some newspaper to forecast the spreading of the epidemic, and we made some terrible blunders because we had sort of projected it based on the data that we had seen, and we expected, I think, 1 million or 10 million people to be affected and so on, and it ended up being a completely different thing. And then I think my realization at that point of time was that we were using very naive sort of forecasting models, but actually what we needed was to much better structural models to understand, like you were saying, Hannah, as to how this spreads, how it's contained, and some of the underlying assumptions. We had to build a structure to the data and then use that structural model to build that, and we didn't do that. And so I have sort of, this time when this happened, I said, I'm not going to project what is going to happen, because there are some people who are saying 70 to 80% of the world will get infected by this, and it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when everybody gets affected. Again, they may be similarly naive. So the key question is, I think, like Hannah mentioned, the balance between being over sort of pessimistic and creating, bringing life to a standstill. And because when panic spreads, the whole world will suffer a lot more than otherwise. And I think fundamentally the two axes of coronavirus is, first of all, how infectious it is, right? And secondly, what is the fatality rate? The infection, it is sort of infectious, but not as infectious as measles. So infection is sort of medium, and fatality rate actually is low.
Yeah.
So what might end up happening is that a lot of people get infected, but only the ones who are anyway weak and anyway in a different, sort of tough situation, they might actually perish. So in a coronavirus-like situation, I think it's probably better to not be overly pessimistic in how we put controls and how the world will work. I think what China has done is great, whereas localized, containing is great, but just to spread fear and panic across the world doesn't seem like the right solution for
Yeah, and this is
That's
an
a hopeful
example.
answer.
This is an example where you don't have all the data, and in fact, we hear that the coronavirus might mutate and everything could change. So with that in mind, how do you apply AI to tackling it, do you think?
On this case, about diseases, you mean, or?
Well, specifically, I think the question is particularly in the case of coronavirus.
Yes,
right?
I think it is. I think it is. Well, you mentioned, I was just thinking as I was listening to you, particularly on the spreading of it, so you can forecast where it is and how bad it will be. But what would be the impact of an AI on the antidote, on the research of the antidote?
Yeah.
Because everything that I've been hearing is that everyone tells me it will take a while before it's ready, 1 or 2 years, and it sounds like an awful long time to me.
But that's because
as a human being.
That's because of human trials, though. That's the main reason why.
So they're
There should be
certainly
a
using
testing
AI
program.
to accelerate the overall building of the vaccine.
Yes.
And testing with fewer samples.
Yes.
AI can inform the solution to the problem.
Right.
But there's currently, that's definitely where AI is beginning to have some role. They're already using some AI techniques to.
So I would focus on that. I think that's the most important one right now, it seems to me. So ask the right question, basically. Focus it on the right thing.
I think. Thank you very much to all three of you. Thank you. A big round of applause for the panel, please.